Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited about tonight's topic. We will be talking about remin, fluoride, and everything in between. Before we get started, there's just a few things to mention. First, you're all muted, so if you have questions, make sure to type them in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some time to answer any questions that come in. If we do run out of time, we will get back to you by email, so don't hesitate to keep the questions coming. And if anyone wants to learn more, contact us to schedule a meeting with you and your team. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Cooch, CEO and founder of CaRe-Free. Dr. Cooch has been successfully practicing dentistry for 35 years. He practices 3 days a week here in Albany, Oregon. He is the world's leading authority on ATP as it relates to caries risk assessment. I know there's a lot of info to get through tonight, so I think we're ready to get into it. Dr. Cooch, you have the floor.
All right. Hey, thank you so much, Nicole. Tonight's going to be an interesting conversation. And I want to thank you all for joining me here tonight on a beautiful, hot August night. It is 99 degrees currently here in Albany, Oregon, which is very unseasonably warm for us. But I'm happy that you're here, and I really appreciate the time that you all spend with me. The last conversation we had in June was on xylitol and brought out some really great conversations that can be, which is the purpose of this is for us to sit down and look at some of these topics and look at both sides of the coin, look at the information, the scientific evidence we had, and then try and work through that and see what kind of sense we can make out of it. So tonight's topic is remineralization and why fluoride isn't enough. And so I'm going to talk about fluoride here a little bit tonight. I thought this was an interesting fact to share with everybody here tonight. This was in the news just recently, and there are 4.8 billion people on the planet that have a cell phone, and there are only 4.2 billion people that have a toothbrush. So more people own cell phones than they own toothbrushes at this point in time. And, that gives us a in the U.S. particularly, gives us a challenge, with the decay epidemic that we have. People are more inclined to have a cell phone than a toothbrush, and so that becomes a challenge. I was on the phone with a doctor earlier today talking about an app for those phones to help prompt and remind people about brushing their teeth or flossing or whatever particular instructions that they want. And we know that I'm not a techie, but John Kois gave me an Apple Watch in July, and I'm not the kind of person that would buy one of these, although I did have a Fitbit a couple years ago until it went through the washing machine. But I have to tell you, I've been wearing this thing for a month, and it's modifying my behavior in terms of the fitness and looking at that. And I think there's a real potential for us, down the road, looking at like something in technology that could help our patients remember to brush and floss. When we talk about remineralization, we're really talking about, it all comes back to balance. It's mineral out of the teeth. You've got to have mineral going back into the teeth. So you want to establish a healthy balance for your patients. If they're out of balance, you've got net mineral loss going on. And we all know that's pH driven, and that's long, periods of low pH that are driving that. And it could be, as we go through our risk assessment, it could be because they don't have enough saliva. It could be from a lot of different reasons. But when we look at that, we really need to keep, our patients in balance. We need to be able to replace that mineral and have that, essentially in equilibrium. And in that situation, you're going to have health. Otherwise, it leads to white spot lesions, and beyond that, it can lead to dental caries. And when we look at, the conversation here tonight really starts with fluoride. And if we go back to ground zero for fluoride, water fluoridation, and it's going to be one of the topics tonight, in the United States started January 25th in 1945 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So let's see, what is that, like 70 years ago? So we have a lot of data. We've had fluoride in our water. We live in the People's Republic of Oregon here. So it doesn't seem like there's an election goes by that some community isn't arguing about whether to fluoridate their water or not, or whether it's toxic and poison. And so, let's take a look at some of the data as we go through there. you know, today now, and this is from 2013, but this is just published this year, we now have 2,184 public water systems nationwide that have fluoridated water and are maintaining a good, consistent level. And, you know, the letter stated, you know, fluoridation continues to remain the most cost-effective way to prevent dental caries. And I still believe that, but I'm certainly starting to question some of that. And I think, you know, if we look at our evidence, I'm not sure that it's as clear-cut as we once thought that it was. So as we get, and the challenge that we've got when we look at water fluoridation is in about 1960, there was widespread use of fluoride in toothpaste, in mouth rinses. So in addition to the fluoridated water, you've got all this other exposure to fluoride, and in the atmosphere, the environment, you have a patient using fluoridated toothpaste twice a day, or maybe using a fluoride rinse as well. You know, in the environment of that much exposure to fluoride, does fluoridated water still provide a meaningful benefit, or is it redundant and doesn't, you know, there's no net increase in benefit by still having the water fluoridated? And one of the other challenges that we have is who drinks tap water today? You know, I mean, that's one of the questions I ask my patients. And I don't drink tap water. Well, I don't drink fluoridated water because I drink tap water at home. We have a well. So when I'm at work 3 days a week, you know, in the Albany water system, and I drink several glasses of water a day or ice that's been made, you know, at the office, it certainly has fluoride in it. But you know, by and large, a lot of Americans, I think there were 11 billion bottles of water sold in the United States last year. You know, by and large, the majority of Americans drink bottled water, which is not fluoridated. And, you know, of course, we've discussed that earlier this year. You know, half of those waters have a pH of 4, somewhere in that neighborhood. So, you know, that becomes an interesting challenge for us to look at. I'm going to give you 3 studies. They all come out of Australia. And the question that they asked was, does water fluoridation provide a benefit? So the first study was on children, and they looked at it in a community prior to fluoridating the water, and then 36 months after water fluoridation to see how did it change the rate of decay on these children. And they looked at basically grade school kids. They were from age 4 to 9 years old. There were 201 kids. You know, they had calibrated people that were screening them. They used bite-wing radiographs, and they looked at their caries rates, and it reduced the caries rate prevalence from 87 to 75%, and there was a 19% reduction in the caries experience in the community, with one of the highest caries rates in Australia, and certainly up in northern Queensland around Townsville, Australia is probably the highest risk caries population in the entire country of Australia. So we've done research in that community as well. So it provided a significant decrease in the caries prevalence in children. So the next question becomes, what happens in, you know, young adults? Now, so again, the study comes from Australia. They looked at about 1,500 young adults. Now, the definition for a young adult was somebody born between 1960 and 1990 in that cohort. So they're somewhere between 15 and 46 years of age. And what they were looking at is if they had about 50% exposure to overall fluoride, more than 50% of their life span to that point in time, or less than 50% of their lifespan at that point in time, that they'd been exposed to the widespread use of fluoride, was there a significant difference? And what they determined was that there was a significant reduction in the decay rate in the DMFT scores and actual fillings, decayed and fills, in those teeth from the cohort that had more than 50% lifetime exposure to a broad exposure to fluoride, in addition to just fluoridated water, versus the percent of or the part of the cohort that had less than 50% of their life expectancy. So we saw a real decrease there, just based on, for young adults, based on fluoridated water, even in the face of broad exposure to other fluoride. And then we had, they looked at adults. And then on the adults, they looked at 75%, more than 75% of their life experience, and compared it to patients that had less than 75% of their, or less than 25% of their life experience as a cohort with a broad exposure to fluoride. And again, what they found was that it was cumulative. The longer or the greater the exposure that they had to fluoride, significantly reduced their caries rates and DMFT scores and decayed and filled scores versus patients that had less than 25% of their life experience exposed to fluoride. So while these don't examine directly, and it's really going to be hard to study, I think that's one of our biggest challenges in research is how do you design a study so that you look at a population and have a control where you're looking at, okay, these patients have only been exposed to fluoridated water, and now we've got patients that have been exposed to fluoridated water plus fluoridated toothpaste, and is there a difference between their caries experiences? And that's the question that that we're trying to ask, and that's a question that we don't really have a lot of data or information or answers for. So that becomes a challenge. But here's 3 studies that were all done. I think they were well done. And they give us evidence that even in spite of the broad exposure to fluoride, having that additional benefit of fluoride in the water appears to be incrementally improving the caries experience of those patients at all ages, both children, young adults, and adults. Now, this study comes from 2006 in Minnesota, and this is a study that is a little disturbing. This is a study that had basically about 45,000 patients, and it was 1 year prior to and 2.5 years post a caries risk assessment taking place in the in this Delta Dental Insurance program. And so they had a large cohort, 45,000 people, and they stratified the patients as high risk, moderate risk, and low risk for dental caries in their insurance data. What they found, then the patients were randomly assigned no fluoride treatment, an in-office treatment, or a take-home treatment with fluoride. And what the end result was, so this was after 3.5 years of exposure, 45,000 patients, what they found was that when you look at the stratifications, it didn't matter whether you had in-office, take-home, or no fluoride, there was no change in the caries rate. The same was true for moderate risk patients. That stratification, the same was true for low risk patients. So the conclusion was there was no benefit of in-office or take-home fluoride, regardless of, or no fluoride, when you looked at those stratifications, just looked at all the high-risk patients and compared their outcomes. So, that the concerning part there is telling us that, well, fluoride may not have a benefit on our adult patients. And I think that's certainly, we have a lot of information on children. We have a lot of data on children that indicates that it's successful. But when you get to adults, that's not necessarily true. We don't have the data. Doesn't mean that it doesn't work. We just don't have data a lot of supporting data and evidence to support that it does. So then this was the Cochrane database, and this was published in the middle of June this year. And this is a systematic review. They looked at 155 papers that met their inclusion criteria. Basically, 107 studies ended up providing the data for their quantitative synthesis. The important thing to note is 71% of the studies that they included in this systematic review were conducted prior to 1975. So again, the question that they wanted to ask is, okay, after broader exposure to fluoride, does water fluoridation still have a benefit in terms of outcome for dental caries? And the conclusion was there's not enough contemporary evidence to demonstrate that it does or it doesn't. And so we do know, if we look at the data from the accumulated data from these studies, the initiation of water fluoridation resulted in a reduction of DMFT scores in primary teeth of about 1.8 DMFT, and that was over about 44,000 participants in all of those studies. And in permanent teeth, a DMFT reduction of about 1.2. And that translates to an overall reduction of about 35% and 26% in the primary and permanent teeth. When they also looked at the percentage of children that were decay-free, they never had any caries experience. After water fluoridation, there was an increase in the percentage of caries-free children of 15% in their deciduous dentition and 14% in their permanent dentition. So certainly we know at the beginning of water fluoridation that, it provided a great reduction. And, we bat around an average figure between primary and permanent teeth of somewhere around 27 to 30%, and that's the kind of data that we see from the CDC. When you talk about the potential downside of fluoride, as fluorosis would be a major concern, they estimated that from the studies, a level of 0.7 part per million, which is about where we're at now in our communities in the United States, of fluorosis that caused an aesthetic concern was approximately about 12% of the population. And if you just looked at fluorosis, period, that increased that to about 40%. So this study came out and I think created a lot of, well, certainly added ammunition for the anti-fluoride camp. And but you have to read through and sift through the conclusions and look at the data to find out what are we really asking here. And what the real question that we're trying to ask is, do we have evidence to indicate that water fluoridation in the advent of this broad exposure to fluoride and all of these other products still makes sense? Does it still add incrementally to our outcome? And the conclusion is, in children there seems to be a net benefit, yet in adults we don't have enough scientific evidence to conclude that it does or that it doesn't. And 97% of the studies were at high risk of bias. So there's, that's our, the Cochrane is our best, I think, independent scientific database to depend upon. So that's certainly, I think, it brings out the point that we don't have the data to answer that particular question. So I think it's still a question on water fluoridation. And then if we look at fluorosis, this study was published this last year in the Journal of Dental Research, and the question was there a quality of life issue with fluorosis? And they looked at about 7,600 students in North Carolina. They were from kindergarten through 12th grade, and they wanted to know, they asked the question, has there been a quality of life issue here? And the conclusion of the study was there was no quality of life issue identified by the student as it related to fluorosis, but there were quality of life issues related to dental caries. So dental caries was an issue, but having fluorosis didn't seem to be a concern to the students, or certainly didn't impact the quality of their life. Now, the next question that we asked about fluoride then in this study was looking at 15-year-olds, and there were about 183 females and 175 males that were all 15 years old, and we can now do a fluorosis scan and look at the lifelong fluoride intake into the bone. So we're looking at growing bone, and the conclusion was there was very little impact of, it appears to be a fluoride in the skeleton that we can measure. So as well as we can determine at this point in time, it doesn't appear to be a problem skeletally. So that's kind of where we're at on fluoride. Then if you go, and I did this, putting this webinar together, I did this and I went to look at, the anti-fluoride camp. And if you go Google, fluoridated water and anti-fluoride and go look at that, there's a tremendous amount of websites. The anti-fluoride camp is, they're active, they're noisy. There's a lot of people involved in it, and there's a lot of different sites, and they're making a lot of claims. I don't know how much scientific evidence that they have. In fact, I question whether they have scientific evidence to support any side effects or the downside here. Certainly we know that the benefit of fluoride in terms of reducing the decay rate, and we have a decay issue in the United States, is an issue, but these are the articles that our patients are reading. These are the websites, and they read something about fluoride. Oh, that's a neurotoxin. Oh, do you want your child drinking that? And they give a whole list of maladies, and there's a number of sites. So, and some of those are pretty aggressive. And so I know that you, like me, have patients that come in every day, and they go, yeah, but doc, I don't want any fluoride. Give me something that doesn't have fluoride in it. I'll use anything, but I don't want anything that has fluoride. And so that's becoming a bigger challenge for us in terms of, so what do you do for that patient? Well, we do have some carie-free products that don't have fluoride in them, that we can help them with, but by and large, we're still prescribing a lot of fluoride to help patients, and we have evidence on the benefit of fluoride in primary teeth, and we extrapolate that evidence onto adults. So when we talk about fluoride and remineralization, there's a lot of confusion on how does remineralization work. And I know that when I first started studying remineralization, I had some paradigms that were incorrect, and I'm not really sure where they came from. But when you really look at the science and understand remineralization, it becomes pretty apparent and clear. One of the things that, and I don't know where this came from for me, in fact, it was interesting. I was just reviewing a paper last night from a professor at a dental school who had written a paper on remineralization and was talking about the abundance of calcium and phosphate ions in the saliva at a pH of 7. Well, let's talk about that for a second. But I had this concept that the way that remineralization occurs, you have these ions in the saliva, and then they met up with the deficient area of enamel, the white spot lesion, and then they formed a new mineral, and the mineral grew. And that's categorically not how it works. What we know is that in the saliva there are nanoparticles, nanocrystalites, and we even know what size they are, and I'm going to show that to you, that are actually crystallites in the saliva. And we have proteins in the saliva that keep those crystallites from attaching to each other and continuing to just grow in mass, but they grow on the surface of the tooth. So the body regulates this, but it's beautiful, how teeth are designed and how this process works. And it's actually a process of oriented attachment. And these little crystallites go in and then attach to the deficiency or the demineralized zone of the enamel. And the remineralization occurs from the outside in. It doesn't occur from the inside out. I know that you're going to hear that in some marketing literature. Show me that science, because that defies the laws of physics for the most part. So when we look at saliva, what's the pH of the demineralization, or the critical pH of enamel is 5.5. So above 5.5, it mineralizes, and below 5.5, it demineralizes and forms ions. The calcium phosphate demineralizes. So above 5.5, you have hydroxyapatite. So when you talk about what do you have in the saliva at a pH of 7, you have hydroxyapatite crystallized. It's not until you get to a low pH, either on the tooth surface or in the saliva itself, that you actually have that demineralization and an ionic condition that can occur. So, above 5.5, well, where is resting saliva? Resting saliva is at 6.75 on average, and stimulated saliva is even higher than that, from 7.8 to 8.0. So our saliva is bathing our teeth continuously in these nanoparticles of hydroxyapatite. That's how God, nature, worked it out. But it's a little more complicated than that, because once you add fluoride to the equation, that critical pH of enamel lowers to around 4.5. So while you've got hydroxyapatite at 5.5 and above, you have fluorapatite above 5.5, but below 5.5 you have hydroxyapatite that becomes ionic, but you don't have fluorapatite doesn't become ionic until it's below a pH of about 4.5. So in that window from 4.5 to 5.5, you've got remineralization occurring on the surface of the teeth as well, and it gives you the opportunity to increase the fluoride, the uptake of fluoride in the form of fluorapatite into the surface of that enamel. Now, one of the other things, this is a paper from 2003 that even makes it yet more complicated, is that the critical pH for enamel is not necessarily fixed. Like, it's dependent upon the abundance of calcium phosphate that are present in the saliva. So the more calcium phosphate that you have, the more that you start with, the more hydroxyapatite that you start with, the more calcium phosphate that you continue to have as the pH drops. That drives the critical pH down lower as well. So on the other hand, if you have somebody that doesn't have enough calcium phosphate or nanoparticles, doesn't have enough saliva, period, you're talking about your hyposalivation patients, the critical pH for their enamel may be higher than 5.5. So, when you look at those patients and you're seeing all of this, root surface lesions and the decay issues on your senior patients or even younger patients that are taking medications, or whether it's an antihistamine or whether it's a ADHD medication or whatever. Drying out the mouth and reducing the amount of salivary flow drives that critical pH up, so we have less margin for error. So it's a really delicate and balanced system, and it's a beautiful system, but it's not as simple as certainly as we'd like to understand it to be. These are some SEMs that Graham Milicic did a number of years ago in a study that we were working on, and it gives you just a chance to look at the enamel rods. And as we increase the magnification here, we know that this whole ionic concept is really flawed. Enamel, like all other crystals in nature, demineralize and remineralize by a process of oriented attachment. So these little crystallites attach and detach, and that's how the enamel rods are constructed and deconstructed. As we look at larger magnification, you can start to get a sense for these, and we actually now know, if we look even bigger yet, we get a sense for these. They look like little Lego, I call them Legos. They're about 20 nanometers in average particle size. That also happens to be the most thermodynamically stable size for hydroxyapatite. When the pH drops, it continues to dissolve down to a pH of 4.5, and then it actually begins to become more dissolution resistant as the pH continues to drop, and that's really an unexpected phenomena. But isn't it interesting that happens to be the most thermodynamically stable size and form, and that's what's in our teeth? And I don't think that was an accident. So anyway, you get a chance to look at these Legos, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's artwork when I look at it. But that's how enamel demineralizes and remineralizes. Now, when we talk about that, what we know is that there's actually those little crystallites abrade off the teeth when the teeth wear. They come off the teeth as the enamel demineralizes. It doesn't come off as ions. It actually, those break off, come off and separate, and then they reattach that way. We know that the saliva is supersaturated with hydroxyapatite and fluorapatite, and our teeth are these artificially hypermineralized structures on our body are maintained by bathing them continuously in a supersaturated solution of the mineral that they're made out of. And if it didn't do that, we wouldn't have teeth. I mean, it's as simple as that. And so we look at, this is Edwina Kidd. She's one of my heroes, one of the great cariologists of our lifetime, and she's retired now, but she's just an incredible mind. When we look at her textbook, then here's the chapter from her textbook. You can look at the chart, and you have fluorapatite, hydroxyapatite, octocalcium phosphate, tricalcium phosphate, brushite, which is yet another form of calcium phosphate. And on the horizontal plane, as the secretion rate increases, the degree of supersaturation of these increase. So as your saliva flow increases, so does the degree of supersaturation of these minerals. So you've already got the minerals in the saliva that you need. The question is, do you have enough saliva? And you've got minerals in the form of hydroxyapatite and fluorapatite, and that's how your teeth are. They're doing that today. Your own teeth are doing that. So looking at that, I went back and looked at, well, why aren't we using fluorapatite? And there hasn't been a lot of research done on fluorapatite in current years, but surprisingly, this was the first paper that was published using fluorapatite. It was 1942, and this is McClendon and Associates did this research, and they looked at fluorapatite, and they put it in the cereal of rats, and it was 0.5 to 0.75% fluorapatite. There's one natural mine, it's in Tennessee, in the United States, that actually has fluorapatite mineral. They ground it up, put it in their cereal, and it delayed the caries in the rats, but not more than 10 part per million in the drinking water. So, we're at 0.7 parts per million in the drinking water. It was as effective as 10 part per million fluoride in the drinking water, just having a little bit of fluorapatite in their cereal. So I'm thinking, well, that's very interesting. Well, then we get to 1945, and now they're brushing the teeth of the rats with fluorapatite gel or paste, and the ones that brushed compared to the teeth in the rats and the littermates that were just brushed, without anything, there was a reduction of decay from 3 DMFT scores down to 0.16. It was an 18-fold reduction in decay over 150 days, brushing these rats' teeth. Now, it's kind of challenging to get, rats to brush their teeth. I think probably maybe less so than patients. But you look at that, just using fluorapatite reduced the decay rate by 18-fold. So that's 1945. So after you get done studying rats, what do? We study, this is World War II, so we studied enlisted men. McClendon again, and they started brushing the teeth of the enlisted men with fluorapatite and compared them to control that was using normal toothpaste at the time, probably a tooth powder. Now, the average service enlisted person in America in 1945 was developing 1.5 new cavities per person per year. And when they compared them to the ones who were brushing with the fluorapatite, it reduced their decay rate to 0.5 new cavities per year. So, a threefold, 300% reduction in the caries rate just using fluorapatite as in their toothpaste. And you get done studying servicemen, we study dental students. So in 1946, then, they did the same study with dental students, and this is what's interesting. Dental students in 1945 were averaging 1.5 new cavities per dentist per year. And again, brushing with fluorapatite reduced their decay rate to 0.5. And again, another 3. So the results were almost identical to the study they did on the servicemen. So, I'm looking at this going, wow. So, like, what happened, right? I mean, it's like, why aren't we all using fluorapatite, in every product today? And I think the question is answered, and I would love to know that. I'd love to be able to ask these researchers, what happened with this research. But I think the question was answered. They attributed the outcome to the fluoride that was in the fluorapatite, not the apatite itself, but to the fluoride. And then Crest in 1951, introduced stannous fluoride toothpaste, and then the rest is history. We started fluoridating our water systems, and throughout the 1950s and 60s, the ADA got heavily involved in promoting fluoride. The conclusion was this is the fluoride. That may not necessarily be so. So let's fast forward to today, and in current times, this is a study that was first published in 2009. Now, I have to tell you that trying to develop pharmaceutical-grade fluorapatite is not commercially viable. However, there was a breakthrough, and we can develop and manufacture pharmaceutical-grade hydroxyapatite nanoparticles. So I thought, well, let's start with that. But let's look at the research then that's been done with nano-hydroxyapatite. So here was a study that was done and used nanoparticles hydroxyapatite. It's a regular deposit on the cell structure of the demineralized enamel, which appeared to form new surface layers. It was concluded that nano-hydroxyapatite had the potential to remineralize initial enamel lesions. So, early studies here on hydroxyapatite, nanoparticle size. And then this was a very study that was also published in 2009, and this is really when the majority of the research, started on nanoparticle hydroxyapatite and remineralization. And what they did was they took demineralized lesions here, treated them for just 10 minutes with synthetic HA nanocrystals, and it induced a consistent enamel remineralization through the formation of a surface of hydroxyapatite coating. And this was biomimetic for composition, structure, size, and morphology on the enamel prismatic surface. So, this shouldn't, but, so this is surprising, but at the same point in time, it shouldn't be surprising. This is how nature does it. This is what happens every day. It's the reason we have teeth. So the fact that we copy nature and we get a result like this shouldn't be that shocking to us. So this, again, was an early study on nanoparticle HA. We did a study that published this in 2013, John Koish, Yada, Graham Milicic, and I've sent blind samples of products, some competitive products on the market, and then we created artificial lesions. We did a double-blind study. We looked at the results and found that just exposure to nanoparticle hydroxyapatite created remineralization and created a new surface of hydroxyapatite on the surface of this lesion. And we actually had that on in artificial saliva for 24 hours. So we know that, it worked as well in our study. Great paper, anyway. I should say if you really want to know about remineralization, that paper, we looked at all of the crystal physics and dynamics and kind of, thermodynamic properties of crystals and of hydroxyapatite. And so if you really want to understand remineralization, that paper, I think, is a really good a source or a really good reference for you to look at. I'm not just saying that because I was one of the authors, but we really broke it down and took an in-depth look at it. So here's a paper then from 2014, and in this paper then they started looking at it. This was a review. They started looking at all of the papers that have been out, because I've just shown you a couple. There have been dozens. In terms of restorative and preventive dentistry, nano-hydroxyapatite has significant remineralizing effects on initial enamel lesions, and it's certainly superior to conventional fluoride, and it's also good for good results on treating sensitivity of the teeth as well. So this was published this last year, and in this paper they concluded that nanoparticle hydroxyapatite was superior to conventional fluoride. In this paper then they looked at groups. Again, they created artificial lesions. These were on 50 bovine teeth, I believe. They took the surface microhardness, and then they looked at them. None of the groups then reached their original surface microhardness, but they compared hydroxyapatite straight up to fluoride. And what they found, however, was that there wasn't any significant difference between the nano-hydroxyapatite toothpaste and ordinary, over-the-counter fluoride toothpaste. So what they found was that it worked as well as fluoride, just the nanoparticle of hydroxyapatite. Now, they didn't use, let me just back up for a second. I have a picture of the caries-free product here. They did not use that product in the study. But I don't have a picture of the gel that they did use, so that was convenient. This was a study then, again, they looked at, I think, 83 human teeth, and they applied sodium fluoride, and then they looked at nano-hydroxyapatite. Again, they compared them straight up, and then they went through a period of cycling, of pH cycling, to see how that would affect it. And then they added a biofilm to the equation as well, and the control was just distilled water in this study. So what they found was that the sodium fluoride resulted in net remineralization, but if a biofilm was present, there was actually net demineralization. The biofilm consisted of, it was a mutant streptococci strain with a bunch of other organisms. In contrast, the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite further reduced the demineralization compared with the control, but the presence of the biofilm even enhanced its effect. So in the presence of a biofilm, which we would happen to have on our teeth, the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite performed even better than the fluoride, and the biofilm actually seemed to increase the effect of the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite. And again, it's like I look at this kind of research, and it's kind of like, isn't that interesting? But isn't that interesting that that's how, billions of years of nature or God had to designed and worked it out. So in this study, the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite was superior to fluoride in terms of remineralization. Now this is a study that looked at 3 different pastes, a standard fluoride paste, a nanoparticle hydroxyapatite paste, and CPP-ACP paste. And then they looked at it to, again, they demineralized, created a demineralized lesion. They treated them. I think in this study they treated them for 12 hours, and then they went back and cycled them through pH changes, and I think they looked at this 3, 6, 9, and 12 days in the pH cycling. And these were on human teeth. I think there was 83 premolars. And it was concluded that the nano-hydroxyapatite and fluoride had the potential to remineralize initial enamel lesions. The CPP-ACP didn't do that. In fact, there was no evidence when you read the paper of there being any significant remineralization, but it could be used in the adjunct to fluoride therapy. One of the things that they looked at was, when they did SEM analysis on this as well, was the fluoride even showed large areas of porosity which weren't present. The nanoparticle hydroxyapatite tended to create a remineralized new surface layer on the teeth. So nanoparticle, however, in terms of surface microhardness in the study was comparable to fluoride. Then they looked at nanoparticle HA and sodium fluoride mouth rinses. And this study came out of Iran. And it was in the Journal of Dentistry. I only laugh because I think there's so much debate on whether or not we can trust the Iranians at the moment. So now we're looking at one of their dental studies. I'm pretty sure we can trust it. But they compared nanoparticle hydroxyapatite and sodium fluoride mouth rinses for remineralization on incipient, again, carious lesions. And they both increased remineralization and surface microhardness on these teeth. And what they found, again, was that the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite was statistically equal to fluoride itself. Now, this was an interesting study where they looked at 4 different agents, and they looked at 4 different pastes. And they used nanoparticle hydroxyapatite. They used, in this study, they used 50 bovine teeth. And again, they created artificial lesions, and they remineralized them, treated them, and then looked at the surface microhardness. What they found was that there are indications that the Nano-HA and the ordinary fluoride dentifrice may decrease erosive lesions, which means they remineralize the erosive lesion, while the other paste, one of them was arginine plus calcium carbonate, and the other one was potassium nitrate with fluoride, may prevent the progression of erosion lesions. So it's like those 2 helped prevent the lesion from progressing. The nanoparticle hydroxyapatite and the ordinary fluoride actually reversed that lesion and decreased the erosive lesion. So again, in this situation, the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite was equal to fluoride. The question I think is fair to ask, do we need fluoride? When you start to look at remineralization, now these are looking at remineralization, not necessarily caries outcomes, but certainly copying nature and looking at creating an environment that mimics nature in terms of creating balance and health is, how much benefit, additional benefit, are we going to get from fluoride? And we don't have, again, we don't have the evidence for that. I can't tell you that it's better with fluoride or better with, or it doesn't matter if you don't have fluoride in there. What we do know is there's a growing body of evidence that nanoparticle hydroxyapatite, either in a gel or a rinse, certainly has the same outcome or better outcome than fluoride does. So we certainly have an opportunity here, and that's one of the reasons that we, picked nanoparticle hydroxyapatite as a calcium phosphate form to add to our product line, with and without fluoride. Certainly in my practice, in the high-risk patients, they're getting fluoride. I'm still a fluoride believer, but I'm looking at the scientific evidence, and even in my own mind starting to question, well, if we don't need the fluoride, is there a benefit from having it in there? It's not harmful, but then I've got patients that come in and go, I don't want fluoride. Well, so at least, I have an alternative for them in the CTX3 gel. It's got the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite, which is maybe a more natural way for them to, depending on how you want to define natural, it might be certainly it's an alternative method for us to help them protect their teeth and create a balance, raise the pH, provide more mineral, and certainly have xylitol as well. So, that's kind of, I tried to give you kind of a fair and balanced view. I know I always get arguments on whether it's fair and balanced, but I tried to show you, the science for fluoride, and there's science that says fluoride doesn't work. And the Cochrane report just came out and said there's no evidence to support its use or to not use it. I still believe in it, and I'm still prescribing it, I'm still using it. But I think, certainly there's, on the horizon, I think we're going to be looking at patients differently and have different opportunities. And certainly we've got those anti-fluoride, that segment of our population in my practice has grown significantly in the last 10 years. And whether it's logical, reasonable, rational, real or not, that's where we're at. And so I need to have an alternative for those patients as well. So the question is, I hope I've armed you with enough information tonight that you could have an intelligent conversation on the topic. And, and again, it's like, I always like to quote the science, look at our evidence, And there's a growing body of evidence now that nanoparticle hydroxyapatite works, and that shouldn't come as, in my mind, shouldn't come as a surprise to us. Again, that's what nature does all day, every day, in every tooth in every mammal on the planet. So, questions?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cooch. So now we'll jump into the Q&As. We've had a lot of questions come in, but we have a little time left, so I think we can answer a few of them right now. I know you went over some of this stuff, but maybe just going a little more in depth if you can and touching on it. So is there a long-term benefit to using nano-hydroxyapatite over calcium and phosphate? Maybe just elaborating a little more on the long-term effectiveness of this, if any.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. I'm looking at this thinking, well, hydroxyapatite actually is calcium phosphate, and it's in the form, it's carbonated hydroxyapatite is calcium phosphate, but it's in the form and the size that's biomimetic for the actual building blocks of the enamel. And so is there a long-term benefit using that over, another form of calcium phosphate? Well, that's what nature does. So I would believe that there is a long-term benefit for that. Certainly in the short term, we've got enough research that indicates it's as good as anything else that we have, because I would say that the best remineralizing agent we've got is fluoride, because we have an abundance of research on fluoride in terms of remineralization. Here we're talking about hydroxyapatite that in the studies that have been done, and granted they were in vitro studies, but they were equal to or superior to fluoride in those studies. So I think that using hydroxyapatite over the long term, I think it makes sense. I mean, that's right. That's how I treat my own teeth, and that's how I treat my patients' teeth as well. But that's right. A great question.
All right, thank you. So then the next question, it sounds like fluoride isn't as effective of a treatment as we used to think. At least, there's still some controversy over it. So why is it still in every major product? And that's really what we're always hearing about.
These are great questions. That's another really good question. And I think probably a better question today than it was like 5 years ago, right? I mean, I'm starting to ask that question myself. It's like, do we need fluoride in these products? When you look at the evidence from the Nano-HA, I'm not ready to take it out yet. I'm not ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, but I'm starting to question that. Why is it in literally every product? Some of that's historical. It dates back to 1951, to 1945 with fluoridated water. And early on we have data that showed the initiation of water fluoridation decreased the decay rate. We know that the initiation of, the broad use of fluoride in dentifrice reduced the decay rate early on. Now we've got, we're using fluoride varnishes on our patients in the practice, and we're using, fluoride at every turn. Patients are getting sufficient exposure to fluoride, even if they don't drink tap water, right? If they're not drinking the fluoridated water. So some of that is historical, and some of that is mandated by the FDA in terms of dentifrices having fluoride in them. So we go back to that, and then to change that, and then we have a lot of scientific evidence on it. In terms of primary teeth, no questions asked. The evidence strongly supports in primary teeth that fluoride works extremely well at all levels of fluoride, on reducing the caries experience in children. In the primary dentition, you get to the permanent dentition, that's where, our research, we don't have as much evidence. Let's say we have some, we have very little is how I would describe it. But so we extrapolate that data and say, well, it still makes sense to use it. And I think so in the meantime, until we have more definitive research, I think that we should all continue to use fluoride, with the exception of we have patients that don't want fluoride. We've got to be able to provide an alternative for them that's effective, that gives them a benefit without having the fluoride in it. So I think we're going to see fluoride around for a long time yet, but there may be a point in time when we have enough evidence to say, we're using other alternative methods and there's no additional benefit from having the fluoride there, but we're not there yet.
All right, thank you. And the last question, this is a good one. I hear this a lot. I'm just working at Caries-Free from different offices. They're asking, they say, I see a lot of dry mouth patients in my practice. Would recommending them to use a product with fluoride and nano-hydroxyapatite in trays overnight be beneficial?
Yeah, and I see, yeah, okay, and I can certainly empathize with whoever wrote this question. I see so many patients that have dry mouth in my practice. The interesting thing is, we went to self-reporting risk factors for dental caries on our risk assessment form probably 4 years ago, and there was a survey done and published in JADA. There was a survey done and published, and they found that self-reported dry mouth was like 7%. In my practice, it's like 43%. Patients come in and tell me that sometime during the day or night they feel like they have a dry mouth, and I agree that those are like more close. 43% is closer to the real number than 7% in my mind. So I think we're all dealing with this. And so when you look at, well, what's the problem with the dry mouth, right? Aside from the fact that the tissue gets a little inflamed or sore or whatever, the problem is that the way we maintain our teeth is to keep them in a solution that's supersaturated with fluorapatite and hydroxyapatite nanoparticles, right? And in a neutral, near neutral or alkaline solution, we bathe them that way. Well, at night, our saliva flow decreases dramatically anyway. We produce about 2 liters of saliva every day, but most of that's during the waking hours. Otherwise, we'd all drown and choke in our sleep. So our salivary output goes dramatically down during the night. And so if you've already got somebody who doesn't have enough saliva, and then you've got an 8-hour period where there's really no saliva on the teeth, these teeth are not being bathed at all. And if they drank a cup of tea that they poured honey in, or they did something like that, or chewed on some mints, or God knows what, right before they went to bed, now you're exposing these teeth to a really bad experience for like 8 hours. So would that benefit? I routinely do that on my patients. If I can't control their caries experience with a normal regimen of products and coaching during the waking hours, I'll put a patient on a tray at night with a nano-hydroxyapatite and fluoride product, and have them just put a small amount in the tray. I put the trays on the teeth and have them wear them during the night, and that seems to work really well. I use that particularly. That's part of my protocol for patients that have Sjogren's syndrome as well. So, and that works extremely well. Anyway, so I would concur. I empathize, and I see that, and that's exactly what I do. So, great question.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Cooch. And again, thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We still have some questions coming in, so look for answers to those over the next few days. If there's a part of the webinar you want to hear again, we will also be sending out a recording soon. Again, please contact us if you'd like to learn more about implementing carie-free in your practice, or if you're interested in scheduling a team meeting. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everybody, and I will see you again at our next webinar. We'll have another exciting topic. So thanks for the great questions, and have a great rest of the summer. Bye-bye.